welcome to episode 1 of my Azalea series. In this first episode, I'm just going to be covering kind of the basics about the hero, and then kind of define some terms as I move forward. So yeah, I guess we'll dive right in. Very start, we've got kind of the core of the hero, which in my eyes is a 3-part combination. We've got Azalea, with her ability to put a card from the arsenal to the bottom of the deck, and the top card of the deck into the arsenal. We've got Death Dealer, which lets you pay 1 resource to put an arrow from your hand into the arsenal to draw a card. And then Skullbone Crosswrap, which lets you flip your arsenal face up to opt 1. Now, all 3 of these are very important tools when it comes to how we view how the hero works. Because we've got all these different tools that involve the top of the deck, we almost treat the top card of the deck as an extension of the hand. So whether I want to get it into my arsenal, whether I want to just look at it, whether I want to draw it, you've got different tools for manipulating what happens to that top card. And so because of that, Azalea has access to a higher quantity of cards than most other decks. You may not be able to use all 6 of those cards, but you get more options for different play patterns. So that is kind of one of her biggest strengths, is that she has access to more cards, and therefore you have more choices on how you want to play out your turns. So these are kind of the 3 pieces that are most used for manipulating that top card of the deck. The hero in general, I guess we'll cover like the strengths of the deck. The deck has access to a lot of different on-hits, almost a toolbox deck of sort, where it's got different arrows that are effective against different decks. And so you kind of get to hone your list depending on who you're playing against, and kind of target what they are most vulnerable to. Additionally, having access to Death Dealer gives us the opportunity to have some very powerful small hand play lines, whether that's 2 or 3 card hands, because being able to pay a resource to draw a card is very, very strong. Drawing cards is, it's strong in pretty much any card game, but it feels very, very strong in this deck and in this game in particular. And obviously Azalea is probably one of the best heroes in the game at drawing cards. You also have access through Azalea's hero ability to get the dominate keyword, which means that when game states start getting down to low health, Azalea is one deck that can really close out games more efficiently than a lot of other decks. So that's kind of her 3rd major strength. As far as weaknesses, she is very much so lacking in armor. In some matchups, we have access to Perch Grapplers, which are going to be a 2-block. But outside of that, we don't have much expendable armor. We technically have Crosswrap and Tunic, but these are kind of key parts in generating value across the game. So they aren't something that you're able to expend as armor block early on. So we have a lot of inflexibility in blocking. If we're blocking, it's almost always from hand or like a defense reaction from arsenal. Perch Grapplers are like it's a one-time thing. You get 2 block in armor, essentially. So you're a little more susceptible to on-hits, in addition to not having access to equipment to use as a tempo swing. So you can't look at a hand and go, this hand's great, I'm going to hold it, I'm going to just throw armor to block. You don't have that freedom that a lot of other decks do, where they have 6 or 8 block in armor or something. The deck also doesn't have a traditional weapon, so Death Dealer, as I mentioned, is a very powerful tool at drawing cards, but it doesn't actually deal any damage. That, combined with the fact that most of the cards in our deck are relatively low value, like the actual printed damage value on them, well, they don't cost as far as pitching. The printed damage on them is going to be ranging is usually between 3 and 5. You've got a few outliers like Enlightened Strike with the +2 mode, and like Red Headshot. But for the most part, each individual card we play is only going to deal 3 to 5 damage. Sometimes less, sometimes 2 or 0. And because of that, if you're not careful, you're very susceptible to your opponent just blocking you out. Because anytime they swing with like a weapon, and we block with a card, we're losing a card. But then every time we swing with 3 cards to deal 9, with all of them dealing 3 damage, and they block with 3 cards for 9, we just slowly move towards fatigue much faster than other decks. As soon as they make us block it all. And kind of the last classic issue that all Rangers have is if you don't draw an arrow, we don't have a traditional weapon. So if you don't draw an attack at all, you just can't do anything. You can draw hands that present 0 damage. And that can really be a big problem if you're ever on the front foot. Because you can't just block out with a bad hand. You just get stuck with a 5-card hand that doesn't do anything. So I think those are the main weaknesses she has. But overall, I think she's in a reasonable spot right now. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is it's in the deck construction aspect, but I'm just going to kind of define how I view different cards within the deck. I'm not going to go over too many of the specific cards, but the focus is just going to be, for when I'm explaining other things, what I mean when I'm talking about cards. So, I've got 5 different card categories that most cards will fall into multiple categories, but everything will fulfill at least one of these roles and can be used for this role. So, the first one is a pretty standard one. It's the case for almost every deck, and that's pitch cards. So, Azalea is kind of an anomaly, where you don't run blues as your pitch, you run yellows as your pitch. And this is because almost all of our turns are going to cost 2 or 1 or 0. So it's very rare that you actually need 3 pitch in a turn. So because of that same point that I was talking about before, where you're susceptible to fatigue, we end up running a lot of yellows. Because when we get to our second cycle, they do more damage than the blues would. Obviously, we're going to still run a few blues, but the majority of our pitch is going to be yellow. So that's the first category, pitch cards. The next card category we'll call is defensive cards. That's how I categorize anything with 3 block or 4 block. It doesn't mean you're always using them as defensive cards, but it means that it's a card you're comfortable blocking with. Anything with a 2 block you really don't want to be blocking with, and that kind of applies to most decks. You're not really happy blocking for 2 with a card. So anything with 3 or 4, we're happy blocking with. The next one is a very important one. I guess this applies as well. Arrows. Arrows are a very important part of the deck. As I mentioned with Death Dealer, I didn't dive too hard into it, but you have to load an arrow to draw a card. So if you don't have an arrow, you're not drawing a card. So arrows are a very important part of the deck that you have to generate your value with Death Dealer. And then we get into the little more complicated parts. So I have 2 different categories here. I call them turn extenders. And this would be a card like, let's just say a Seek and Destroy. And what I mean by turn extender is, well, actually, I need to define turn ender first. So a turn ender is an attack that does not have go again. We'll take, for example, Red in the Ledger. That is an attack that does not have go again, and that's typically what you're going to end your turn on. For the most part, that's going to be our 1-cost arrows. The exception would be like an Enlightened Strike can occasionally be a turn ender, but for the most part, it's going to be your 1-cost arrows. So on your standard turn, you're going to be pitching, we'll say pitch a yellow, load an arrow with Death Dealer, fire the arrow. So then when I reference turn extenders, I'm talking about any card that can fit within that same play pattern of loading an arrow and firing an arrow with no real consequence. Like, I can add in a Seek and Destroy to that play pattern, but that play pattern doesn't inherently change. I can add in a Ravenous Rabble to that play pattern, and that play pattern doesn't, it doesn't mess with it. I still have my ender and I have my pitch. I just added in extenders in the middle of it. So these are pieces that you can kind of add in when you have them and just be happy about it. There's no like major downside to it. As opposed to having like 2 arrows that don't have go again, you'd have to use like Snapdragon scalars to be able to fire the second arrow. So those either are not possible to extend with or require a bunch of extra hoops to extend with. So that's what I'm going to mean when I refer to turn extenders. So based on those definitions, we have kind of a very premium overlap between these between these categories, and that is our defensive extenders. These are cards that we are comfortable blocking with, like Enlightened Strike, that can also be used to fit into like a 5-card hand, that it's not going to have a card stuck in your hand. You are able to still play out the Enlightened Strike with Go Again and kind of extend the turn, while also, if you need to defend, you can defend with it. And this is really important because, like I mentioned, I need 1 arrow in my hand and I need 1 pitch in my hand, right? Now, the other 2 cards are kind of the expendable cards. If they're both 2-block extenders, and I need to block, all of a sudden this is awkward because I don't want to block with these, but these are the expendable cards in my hand. However, if my extenders are 3 blocks, now I don't mind blocking with them because it doesn't mess up my core pattern of pitch a yellow, load an arrow, fire an arrow. So these 3-block extenders are very, very premium. So we actually have Enlightened Strike is, well, it's not the best extender. It's a little bit inefficient to play it with Go Again. It still is an option. So when you have tempo and you need to play it as an extender, you can, but oftentimes this card is, ideally, 5-draw card is your best mode with it when you have that opportunity. Coming in for 7 comes up occasionally, and Go Again is an option, but oftentimes this card is just blocked with. The next is Deadeye, which people ask me all the time, why are you running Deadeye in this list? You don't have any aim counter support. And it's for that exact reason I was just explaining. It's not, it is a little bit awkward to play as an extender, but it fits both as pitch and as a 3-block, with the option of being an extender. Makes it incredibly versatile, and it can be difficult to explain to people how important having your extenders block 3 is in the deck until you've played it a bunch of times and realize just how valuable that is. Next one is Knock the Death Whistle. This is, I'll get into it more later, but is blocked and pitched with a lot. Yeah, I'll dive into that more, but it can be used to extend, as in, if it's an extra card in my hand, I can play it to get Dominate or something on a turn. Then we have Sigil of Solace, which is not a traditional extender in the fact that it doesn't actually, or 3-block extender, it doesn't actually block 3, but it essentially blocks 3. And it's a card that it has a lot of interesting applications, but I guess I'll get into that in a little bit. But it technically fits in this category. And then we get to what I think is now the MVP of the deck, Bolt and Shot, as a 9 of. These are conditionally, emphasis on conditionally, you have to draw a buff with them, but they're conditionally 3-block extenders that are also above rate. And what I mean by above rate is Bolt and Shot is a extender that deals 4 damage in red, whereas most of our red buffs as extenders are only doing 3. So this is 1 above rate. It can fill in as a 3-block. It can fill in as an arrow. And yeah, it's above rate. It does everything you want. It's the best arrow in the deck. I know that that's a weird thing for people to hear. For those of you who have watched from the outside looking in at Azalea, everyone always talks about, oh, Red in the Ledger is the best card in the deck. No, Bolt and Shot's the best card in the deck. Bread and the Ledger's close, but it's Bolt and Shot. As I dive into more in-depth stuff about the deck, hopefully I'll be able to convince you, but Bolt and Shot's the best card in the deck, in my opinion. Well, yeah, in the main deck. For equipment, and if you add any equipment and stuff, it's Death Dealer, and then Cross Wrap, and then Bolt and Shot. Alright, that's 3 block extenders. And that's the main kind of overlap one that I wanted to mention, because that is the one where it matters the most to be overlapping. Obviously, you're going to have overlap between like arrows and pitch, extenders and pitch, defensive cards and pitch occasionally, arrows and defensive cards all overlap because all of your arrows block 3. Yeah, but that's roughly how I can categorize stuff, and I'll be referencing that as I continue through this. Next thing I've got is kind of the core concepts on how the deck is played, and like some foundations to how we view the deck and how you approach different scenarios. So, like I was mentioning before, the top card of the deck is essentially an extension of your hand. It is a card that you have access to most of the time. So, while it may not be, while you have access to 6 cards, you don't actually have all 6 cards. Like, it's not an actual 6-card hand, but you have access to it. And so, you have a lot of flexibility in your play patterns. Which means that in order to properly utilize that, ending your turns with a card face down in Arsenal is quite ideal. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do it every turn, but whenever possible, whenever you have the option, you're going to be looking to end your turn with a card face down in Arsenal. And that's just because the start of your next turn, you flip with Cross Wrap, and now you know what that last card in your hand is, and it also gives you, you know what that extended card is, and you have access to it with Azalea immediately. Whereas if you don't have a card in your arsenal, now you don't know what's on top, and you can only draw. You can't send it straight to the arsenal with Azalea. As far as Azalea's ability, I know a lot of people tunnel vision on the, you put a top card of your deck into your arsenal, and then if it's an arrow, it gains Dominate. Obviously, you want to use that additional text, so therefore, Azalea's ability should be used on arrows. Would be the kind of straightforward conclusion when you read this for the first time. I find myself using Azalea's ability on non-arrows very, very frequently. It might even be more often than on arrows, but I don't know the exact numbers, but it's very close. Yeah, using that as a tool to manipulate the cards that you have access to is much more important than the Dominate keyword. The Dominate keyword is honestly a bit overrated. In a lot of situations, Dominate is not the correct play. It sounds good, but oftentimes it's just not correct. And many newer Azalea players will find themselves tunnel visioning on the Dominate keyword instead of just playing efficiently and utilizing the flexibility that you have between Death Dealer, Azalea, and Cross Wrap, as well as the value generated off of card draw. So, kind of like a standard, like basic, bare bones, standard line would be something like, we've got, I don't know, let's just say we've got to release the tension in Arsenal, face down, and a yellow, and a sleep dart. It would be something like Cross Wrap to opt, revealing the release the tension, look at the card on top and go, do I want that card in my arsenal at the end of the turn? If I do, I'll leave it there, otherwise I'll send it to the bottom. Then just play your buff. Pitch, activate Death Dealer, load your arrow, draw your card, fire your arrow for 8, and arsenal. So that's 2 cards for 8, because the card we pitched got replaced by the Death Dealer draw, and you just go back to having your arsenal. 2 cards for 8 is a very good rate. We've seen that with like Swing Big from Brute. We've seen that in Icelander. They're playing Wounded Bull, so they can do 2 cards for 8. So this is 2 cards for 8 with locking down defense reactions from Arsenal and an on-hit. So that just shows kind of the power of these 2-card hands, is what other decks are trying to do, or wish they could do in some cases. And obviously in this situation, we've got our pitch, we've got our ender, and then any extenders we have, whether that's, I don't know, grab a Ravenous Rabble and a take game, we can fit those in just fine. You cross-strapped opt, see a red on top, play the Rabble, then play the Release the Tension, pitch, load, draw, or sorry, this is still in hand. Draw random card, play the take aim, sleep dart, or 4 into 11 into an arsenal. And that would be what you would do, which is why on most of these hands you're going to want a much higher ratio, or in the way that the deck is built, you want a much higher ratio of turn extenders than you do enders. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit oversimplified of how the deck works, but that is going to be kind of the backbone or core of a lot of these play patterns that you're going to be taking. You don't need to dominate. Your just raw damage numbers presented are enough to maintain tempo quite well. What do I got next? The deck construction as far as like ratios. So I don't have the math to back a lot of this up. I've played a ton of games, and these are the ratios that have felt best. I've tweaked them, gone up and down on different things over time, and these are, I think, are going to be very, very close to the ideal ratios. I don't know how to do the exact math on what actually is the perfect ratios on these cards, but this is what I've kind of come up with. And that is going to be for arrows. I run 40% of the deck as arrows. Note that I mentioned 40%, not a number, which would be 24 when you're playing 60. And that's because, as I mentioned, being susceptible to fatigue, there are going to be matchups where you're playing above 60 cards, and in those you just increase your number of arrows to make sure you stay at a consistent ratio. The next one is pitch. It's roughly a third of your deck is going to be yellow or higher, or yellow or blue rather. And that's just because most of these turns cost 2. If you draw an all red hand, you're going to end up depending on like your tunic resource to bail you out of that. However, you do still need a lot of blue or a lot of reds, so you can't bump your pitch up too high. Obviously, in matchups like Icelander and Kano, where you need to be using Arcane Barrier, you'll bump up your yellow and blue counts a little bit higher. That's just basic stuff because your pitch becomes how you block. And then for turn extenders. Now, I am going to be counting conditional extenders, which are your Bolton shots, which are only extenders when you have a buff. But for the most part, you're going to be looking at like 60 to 70% of the deck as possible extenders. And that seems like a very high number. And a lot of those cards are, stuff like Deadeye, stuff like Knock the Death Whistle, stuff like Rain Razors, stuff like Read the Glide Path Yellow. Like, oftentimes these are going to be your pitch cards, but they need to be there as options for extenders, because whenever you're on the front foot and have tempo, you need to be able to play out your 5-card hands. One of the worst things that can happen in this game is you have complete tempo and then you draw a hand like that. 2 arrows and 2 defense reactions. And you go, wow, my entire turn deals 5 damage now, even though I had a 5-card hand coming into this turn. So the deck is built to have a ton of these extenders. Obviously, a hand like this does happen. Ideally, not when you have tempo, but it does happen from time to time. But the goal is to make sure that you've got the ability to play out as many of the cards in your hand on any given turn when your opponent had like blocked with their entire hand. And you want to be able to play them out efficiently, obviously. Yeah, so those are kind of the important ratios. Oftentimes, depending on the match, or actually, yeah, I guess I'll dive into that. Depending on the matchup, depending on how much you're planning on blocking, you're going to kind of replace extenders with defense reactions. And that's because obviously, if you're trying to be blocking more often, you just want the defense reactions instead of those extenders. Just like I was talking about, extenders are the cards that are kind of expendable for you to block with. So if you're already planning on blocking a ton, why run a 3-block or a 2-block extender when you could run a 4-block defense reaction and just block with it? But obviously you can't go too high on these defense reactions because you can run into bricks where you need to be able to play aggressively. Yeah, so the next one would be different types of play lines. Now, the order that I have these in is a little bit weird, but hear me out. So, the very first type of play pattern for Azalea is the one that people associate immediately when you say, wow, a strong Azalea play. They think, ooh, it's going to be like play out a buff and then knock the death whistle and then redden the ledger for 8 with dominate. And all of a sudden, you're guaranteeing you're going to force this on hit through. So this category I call forcing on hits. And this is using your dominate keyword to make sure that these detrimental effects hit the opposing hero. And I think those kind of powerful effects that people think of, like Red in the Ledger, are very often a trap to newer players or newer people playing the deck. I'm not saying those play patterns are always bad, but they're often not as good as they seem. Because, I mean, I've seen plenty of times where you've got, let's just say, a hand like this with no defense or no tunic resource, and we'll just say no arsenal for simplicity. What I'll see people do is go like, or sorry, not Red in the Ledger. We'll grab a different arrow, Sleep Dart. What I'll see people do is like knock the death whistle, put a Red in the Ledger on top, reload the Sleep Dart, activate Azalea, get the Red in the Ledger, play Release the Tension, pitch 8 dominate. Now, don't get me wrong. Oh, 8 dominate, nothing left. Don't get me wrong, 8 dominate, no D-reacts from Arsenal. This is going to connect. They'll block 3 probably. And now all of a sudden, they take 5, and they're stuck with spare cards they can't use. Which is reasonable. But if you compare it to the alternative would be pitch the knock, load the arrow, draw a card, play out these, Sleep Dart comes in for 11, and I have a card in my arsenal. So I did 3 extra damage and got an extra card on this line. Now, the other Red in the Ledger line, let's just say they didn't have an arsenal, you're playing against a Phi, they block with 1 card, E-strike you for 7, and then arsenal the other card, and you just got kind of demolished on that turn cycle, because they got to build up their arsenal, whereas a line like this, you're actually pushing damage. So, even against a Phi, it becomes debatable as to which line is correct. So, Yeah. I guess kind of the takeaway there is dominate red in the ledger is not always the correct play, even when you have access to it. As powerful as the effect is, it is not the most ideal all the time. And especially that 8 dominate, let's just say they had a sink below in hand, and they throw 2 pieces of equipment in front and the sink below. All of a sudden you dealt 0 damage, they lost a card from hand, and they get to play out their hand. Whereas this actually pushes damage still. Yeah, so that's my opinion on those cards there. But yeah, that's the first type of line, is dominating an on-hit. And that's purely for the sake of disruption. The next one on the list is threatening damage, which specifically taking the line that threatens the highest number. We're not paying attention to on-hits, really. The goal is just big number good. And surprisingly, big number is pretty good. I think a lot of decks, or a lot of players playing this deck, tunnel vision on your access to disruption and think that the point of the deck is to disrupt your opponent. And people lose sight of how Flesh and Blood actually works. Flesh and Blood is a game where your goal is to reduce your opponent's health to 0. Slowing them down does not inherently win you the game. Disruption is not a win condition. Damage is a win condition. Disruption is a tool that's used to let you deal damage. It's a tool for winning the game, but it is not how you win the game, or it is not a win condition in and of itself. So understanding when you should be pushing damage and when you should be disrupting is something that I think a lot of, like I mentioned, a lot of newer Azalea players don't understand. They think Azalea ability dominate, Azalea on hits disrupt, that's how I win, that's what the deck does. And while it does have access to those tools, that's not the focus, or it shouldn't be the only thing you're tunnel visioned on. But I'll cover more of that. I'm going to be doing other videos on specific matchups, and I'll be doing VOD reviews and stuff, and I'll be explaining a lot of these different lines. But that's kind of the two main competing types of lines. The last two are much less common, but they do have specific applications in situations. The first one is forcing on hits. And this is specifically, or sorry, no, not forcing on hits. It's forcing damage. So this is specifically a line that is taken, I guess, let me backtrack slightly. That second type that I explained, threatening damage, is always going to be the highest number you can threaten. Now, these other categories can be in multiple categories. So a line that forces damage with a tall dominated attack can also be the highest threatened damage turn. It's very possible that those two kind of objectives, forcing damage through a dominate and representing the highest possible damage, are the exact same line. And in that case, it doesn't really matter how you qualify it, but it's probably a good line if you have access to both of those. However, there are situations where you have the choice of dominating a tall attack or not dominating an even taller attack or a wider turn and representing more total damage. And that's where the difference would be, is whether you're forcing damage through with a dominate or threatening damage just through raw numbers. And then the last one is just threatening on hits, which is a very powerful tool that I think is kind of understated a lot of times when people look at the deck. And that would be like against a Fi. If I fire red in the ledger for 11, their hand doesn't block well. They can't block it and have a turn. It doesn't matter if it has dominate. Their turn is ruined. So red in the ledger for 11, obviously they get to throw their entire hand, but they're not happy about throwing their hand anyways. So you'll have opportunities where this is kind of an anomaly of a line where it would be, or no, it's not that weird. Let's just say hypothetically you were in a situation where you had a Ravenous Rabble, a Take Aim. Yeah, we'll just go with this. And we'll just go with no Tunic. So you could Ravenous Rabble, and then pitch the card you draw, Red the Ledger for 5. Oftentimes this line will represent 9 damage, 4 and 5. Or you could pitch the Rabble, load the Red in the Ledger, play the Take Aim, pitch the card you draw, Red in the Ledger for 8. So this would be a line that's threatening an on-hit for 8. It's a lower total damage, but it's threatening a taller on-hit. And into something like 5, this would probably be a stronger line, because this Rebel line, they don't care about this Rebel damage, and oftentimes they won't block it. And then this Red in the Ledger, they'll throw a 3 block and a card from hand, and still be, an equipment, and then they'll be able to still have their turn. So this would be kind of that small difference in a line that which one represents more damage, and which one represents higher damage on an on-hit. So I think that's roughly how I categorize most of these lines, and I think the rule of thumb for me is that second type, threatening raw damage, is usually the correct line. Outside of decks that are super susceptible to specific on-hits, that's the strongest line, is the highest damage number. And a lot of newer Azalea players, I think, get that confused as either threatening the highest on-hit number or dominating an on-hit. They focus as the strongest line, which is oftentimes not the case. So if there's anything you take away from this video, it's going to be that thing. It should be that thing that I said a minute ago, is disruption is not a win condition. Disruption is a tool to help you win the game with damage. And I think knowing that is going to help a lot when playing this deck. Or you might know it, but actually applying that is easier said than done, I suppose would be one way of phrasing it. The next basic category is blocking, which I think I briefly touched on while talking about the cards. And so you have the flexibility of blocking with these 3-block extenders a lot of times, but then whenever you draw a hand, let's just say with multiple ender cards, you typically want to block with all but one of them, if given the opportunity to. And that's strictly because you can obviously only play one ender per turn on most situations. Obviously there's, Snapdragon or Perch Grappler lines where you can use multiples, but on your average turn you can only play one, and if you plan on drawing a card with Death Dealer, you don't want to risk drawing a third one. Because if you draw a third one, now you've got a stranded card in hand. So if, let's just say, this was my hand, extender. This was my hand. I would say block with Drill Shot, pitch the Headshot, load the Remorseless, play the Read the Glide Path, Remorseless for 7. Or even spicier, block with both of those, pitch, load, come in for 5. Depending on what they give me access to. But the reason you don't want to hold the 2 arrows, I know it's kind of silly to have to explain this, but the reason you don't want to hold both of those arrows is if I pitch this Headshot, load the Remorseless, and go, I'm just going to Arsenal the Drill Shot at the end of the turn, and then I draw a Sleep Dart, and now I go, shoot, I can't use one of these cards. So one of these cards is getting wasted. Keep forgetting about this glare. I apologize. So yeah, blocking with spare enders is kind of something you should make sure you're trying to do whenever possible. The deck is built to not have too many or too high of a ratio of enders. It's usually going to be about a quarter of the deck, because a lot of your arrows are those sleep darts. But yeah, that's your basic of blocking. And then obviously the next thing you're looking at is blocking with blocking cards or 3-block extenders. As with most other decks, you want to avoid blocking with 2 blocks whenever possible. It's not always possible, but that should be the baseline goal. The next one is powerful combinations of cards that you should be looking for. And kind of powerful combinations of cards that you should be playing into. Now, the first one, I think, is pretty straightforward for those of you who are familiar with Rangers. Shows up a lot in Lexi, but it has a lot of applications here in Azalea as well. And that is Rain Razors with something like a Bolt and Shot. So whether that's just having these show up together is very powerful. Even something as simple as, let's go, or I guess just for simplicity, we'll do that. Something like this, where you get to go pitch, load the Bolt and Shot, draw a card, play this out, 7 go again. They block 7, you Rain Razors, it goes up to 9, reload the Sleep Dart, come in for another 7. That's 16 damage off those 4 cards, which is pretty good. We have the Bullseye Bracers, which are typically going to be used in a line like this, where your opponent is able to block out this first Bolt and Shot. And specifically if you're in a situation where you've got like this still in hand, a D-React, or any 2 cards left in hand after they've already blocked the first Bolt and Shot with a Rain Razors in play. In a situation like this, Bullseye Bracers translates to 8 damage off this Sleep Dart that you would have just wasted otherwise. So getting 8 damage off your one piece of equipment is pretty good. That's a situation where you would look to be using that. But yeah, Rain Razor Bolt and Shot lines are some of your highest damage output lines that you can have, because you end up getting this buff to be 0 for 4, 0 for 6. I mean, I've had it up to 0 for 8, where I got to fire 4 arrows. Just a very powerful combination of cards. And as a result, oftentimes when I'm presented the opportunity, I'm going to be looking to Arsenal Bolt and Shots or Arsenal Rain Razors, because then you have a good chance of drawing into the other piece that kind of completes that little bit of combo there. Also, Bolt and Shot and Arsenal is just incredibly strong, because even on a hand like this, we'll get rid of the Rain Razors for simplicity. Even on a hand like this, you can just go like Seek and Destroy, Bolt and Shot, pitch, load, draw, I don't know, Sigil of Solace, play the Sigil, and then Sleep Dart for 5. And this becomes 12 damage off of 2 cards? Or I guess if I played the Sigil, 15 value off of... No, that was 4, right? No, 15 off of 3. Because I started with these 4. No, I started 5. I don't know. Either way, it's efficient. I think it's 15 off 4, which is pretty good. Yeah, 15 off 4 is a pretty good rate. Yeah, sorry. Or we'll just say you draw the Fate Foreseen off that. Like you flip the Bolt and Shot, reveal the Fate Foreseen on top. So then that becomes 12 threatening, 2 different on hits for 3 cards. Because you still got the Arsenal. Right? That's how math works. Yeah. Because I went into the turn with these 4 and yeah. Sorry, math is hard. 15 or 12 for 3 cards, threatening 2 different on hits. Very good. Next combination that you're looking for as one of your more powerful lines would be something like, I guess we can just have these two. You block with everything else, and you've got this plus a tunic resource available. You get to go tunic resource for Death Dealer, load the bolt and shot, draw a card, seek and destroy into bolt and shot. This, and you have a leftover card you drew to arsenal. This used tunic resource and 1 card for 7 damage. It's pretty good rate because we replaced, or we got to draw a card. So that's notably above rate. Typically using 1 card in tunic resource is around 5 value. We got 7, threatening an on-hit. And kind of the extension of this, my favorite play pattern, when it shows up, would be this. So it could be some combination of this, or where one of these is on top of the deck. It's just tunic, Death Dealer, load a bolt and shot, draw a card, seek and destroy, bolt and shot, 7 go again, E-strike 5, draw a card, bottom and draw. In the end, this line threatens 12 using tunic resource and a net usage of 2 cards. 2 cards for 12 is very above rate. Icelander's playing Wounded Bull, so they can do 2 cards for 8, and this is 2 cards for 12. The other nice thing about that line is on the bolt and shot coming in for 7, we've got 2 in hand. So decks are often incentivized to try and block this bolt and shot, thinking there's another arrow in hand that if you reloaded, you'd get to fire. So I've gotten people to block with 3 cards here, and then an E-strike for 5. So I get 5 damage and take 3 cards from them using 2 cards of mine. So it's just crazy value. Like almost on the level of like CNC Tunic Pummel. CNC Tunic Pummel is still probably better. Yeah. But it's pretty close. Like, this is a crazy value off of just a couple cards. So anytime you see this particular line, it's really good. Obviously, bolt and shot can also be swapped out for just like a drill shot, and then just take off the E-strike at the end. Even if it's something just as simple as block with everything but this drill shot. Tunic, load drill shot, fire drill shot, blind arsenal. We just use tunic resource for 4 damage. That's like Rosetta Thorn levels. Seek and destroy with an arrow tutor is kind of the last one I want to talk about. And this is kind of where the exception to me talking about how oftentimes like Red in the Ledger dominated off of a Knock the Death Whistle is often an overrated line. When you have a Seek and Destroy attached to that into like an aggressive deck, it's much less overrated. The reason being is that unlike this line, pitch, load the arrow, draw a card, knock the Death Whistle, tutor the Red in the Ledger, play the Seek and Destroy with the Red in the Ledger. Part of the issue you have off of a lot of these Red in the Ledger lines is your opponent still gets to an arsenal and then crack back with a 5-card hand on the next turn. So you're not really slowing that down. And the value of Red in the Ledger is often going to come down to how many cards they have wasted at the end of their turn. So let's say, for example, I don't know, this is their hand and you dominate a Red in the Ledger. They get to, or this isn't applicable because Fi doesn't have headshot and they can, yeah, we'll just say something like this. This is the Fi's hand. If they had a 4-card hand and no arsenal and you dominate Red in the Ledger, they sink below, E-strike for 7 arsenal, and your Red in the Ledger did nothing. Or the on-hit did nothing. If they had an arsenal, you know, they sink below, E-strike for 7, they lost 1 card because they only got to draw 3 at the end of their turn. So that Red in the Ledger had 1 card of value. Now, when you add in the Seek and Destroy, it blows up their arsenal as well. So your Red in the Ledger value is amplified by an entire extra card, which is usually 3 to 4 value or something. So Seek and Destroy tacked onto a Red in the Ledger against wide decks is very much so worth using a Dominate on. However, if it doesn't have the Seek and Destroy, and especially if they don't have an arsenal, that Red in the Ledger line is often not as effective as you'd think it would be. Another one, this would be more so off of like a Read the Glide Path, where you don't get to choose your arrow. But if you can find like a Read the Glide Path, find a Remorseless, and go Seek and Destroy plus Remorseless, and they had a D-React in Arsenal, you just get to destroy their D-React for free, because they can't play it out on their next turn. Keep in mind that this line is a lot less effective than it used to be because of Crown of Providence, but it still does have applications. If you think there's a D-React in Arsenal, a Seek and Destroy Remorseless, it doesn't actually even have to be dominated, because it's something that they have to fully block, otherwise they're going to lose their D-React. And then maybe you could push it over with like a Rain Razors and just kind of run away with the game at that point. But Seek and Destroy is a very, very powerful card. When this was revealed, I did not think it was that good. I thought it was like a small upgrade from Nimblism. I was very wrong. This card's insane. But yeah, Seek and Destroy amplifies a lot of your... is a very, very strong on hit. Yeah, that's where I'll leave that. So those are kind of the 3 main card combinations that I'd keep my eye out for. As far as like very efficient, very powerful card combinations there. And obviously there's others, and you'll get to, as you draw different hands, you'll get to piece together other things. But those are 3 that I keep my eye out for in particular. The last thing I wanted to briefly talk about was matchups. I'm not going to break down each individual matchup, but what I do want to add is that Azalea has always kind of had this categorization by people as an aggro killer. And while we do have good aggro matchups, I think Azalea has a much stronger mid-range matchup than aggro. That could also be partly because of how I have my deck built, but the aggro matchup does feel very losable when, if you draw a bad hand, you can kind of just die to aggro. Whereas against like a mid-range deck, because we're getting value and we get to play these very efficient like 2-card hands, turn over turn, we're gonna slowly take a lead over things that are wanting to play kind of take a little bit of damage, block a few cards, swing some damage, let me block. Like these mid-range decks are going to get outvalued turn over turn by us. And the game goes just long enough to where that gap in value gets bigger and bigger, but it doesn't go long enough to where we run out of cards. Whereas against aggro, like I said, you could draw a bad hand and all of a sudden just die, because sometimes aggro just high rolls you. So I think our strongest matchups are the mid-range decks. Things like Rhinar, things like Dash, things like Dory. These are all matchups that I feel very comfortable in, and that if you just pace the game properly, you have a pretty notable advantage. But then obviously, yeah, like I said, the aggro matchups are still pretty good because your opponents are going to struggle against all of the on-hits. The kind of difficult matchups for the deck are going to be anything that is trying to fatigue you. And I guess that's another consequence of how I have the deck built. The fatigue matchups traditionally should have been very, very, very difficult, and I've built the deck to kind of counteract that, to where you have the tools to beat these fatigue decks. It can still be a challenge, but you do still have the tools. So I think that weakened the aggro matchups slightly. They're still good, but it brought the ability to beat these defensive decks. Oldham is still by far the most defensive deck in the game and a bad matchup for us. It is a challenge to kill him because he has the ability to block like 7 without or through Dominate, through Crown, Earth React, and Rampart. However, with the new drill shot that we've gotten in the new set, we have the opportunity to hit the Rampart at an early stage in the game, which then kind of invalidates Oldham's ability to fatigue, or at least makes it much harder. Additionally, Oldham's have moved away from a lot of the Earth cards. A lot of lists are down to just Autumn's Touch, and maybe like 6 reacts, so that makes the matchup a little bit better. So the matchup's very doable. It's a difficult... Yeah, it's a complicated matchup, and I'll dive into that more in another video. But other decks that try and play a control game plan into us, I don't think have the tools. If you play carefully, I don't think they have the tools to run us out of cards. Arachne is probably the next closest, but I still don't think that he can do it consistently. And then the last matchup that I wish didn't exist is Dromai. Dromai doesn't really fall into any of those other categories. But Dromai is a deck that is going to kind of ramp up its damage over turn if you don't kill the dragons, and we don't have effective ways of killing a lot of these dragons. I think this version that I have is better than some of the others have been in the past, with access to stuff like Bolt and Shot, to where you can hit a dragon and then still hit them in the face. Things like Ravenous Revel, but I don't currently have any poppers in the deck. And so Dromai is definitely our worst matchup. Sorry, I'm losing my voice about an hour in. Dromai is our worst matchup, and I don't know how to fix it. So it's a pretty miserable matchup. It is winnable. You deal with kind of the bigger dragons early on, and then hit them in the face and hope it's enough. Hope you can connect some sleep darts and redden the ledgers to slow them down. But overall, it's rough. But outside of the Oldham matchup and the Dromai matchup, I think Azalea has legs into, or is at least is close to even or favored into pretty much everything else. So I think she's in a pretty reasonable spot going into this next ProQuest season. It's part of why I'm making these videos and running the streams. If you haven't caught my streams, hopefully I'm still running them when you're watching this, but ideally, between the streams and the videos, I'm hoping to help some more people who might have been curious about Azalea learn to play the deck a little bit better. And hopefully Azalea will get her first Living Legend points during this next ProQuest season. That is my goal. I'll be playing her at quite a few ProQuests, but I will be very happy if someone else is able to do it as well. I think that's 1 hour kind of intro to Azalea. I think most of the follow-up videos are going to be focused on specific matchups. I don't think I'm going to cover every matchup because I don't know that I could do a whole video on the Levi matchup. I'm just not familiar enough with it. But I'm going to be focusing on kind of the meta matchups, and should hopefully have some VOD review and stuff mixed in there. But keep your eye out. I think Oldham will be the first one up. I've got a very good Oldham game to review. Hopefully I can get in some Fi and Icelander in the near future as well. And I'm going to try and keep these coming out at a reasonable pace. So for those of you who are still here, I really appreciate you guys sticking around and listening to me ramble. This is the first video I did that was roughly scripted, so hopefully that was noticeable and kept me from going off topic too much. It wasn't a perfect script, but I had rough talking points instead of my normal rambling, so I hope that helped. But yeah, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode.